Gaming feminists just discovered Islam and it's not going well. The Geena Davis Institute on Gender in Media, a self-proclaimed moral authority on representation, has become a shockingly influential force behind some of gaming's most loathed modern trends, from forced diversity quotas to algorithmic inclusivity audits that reduce creative work to box-ticking exercises. In previous uploads, I've exposed how they do this using literal box-ticking documents within their GDI playbook, a framework explicitly designed to quantify diversity in character design, dialogue, and narrative structure. According to their own website, this system has been adopted across the entertainment industry, influencing everything from Hollywood productions to video game development pipelines. What began as guidance for fairer representation has quietly evolved into a creative straitjacket that dictates how stories are told. The result has been devastating for storytelling. Writers and artists are no longer free to create characters that feel real, flawed, or even beautiful. They're pressured to conform to ideological templates that value messaging over meaning. Worse still, the Institute's philosophy reduces creativity to compliance, framing women as fragile collectives in need of narrative protection and treating sexuality and identity as statistics to be managed. The outcome is a generation of lifeless characters stripped of individuality, complexity, and humanity. It's why so many modern AAA games feel soulless, their casts shaped not by imagination but by fear of breaking the rules written by people who no longer understand what makes a good story. And get this, the very same group of people who insist that pride flags should appear in every game, in every menu, and on every loading screen are now the ones preaching to us about Islam, providing us with yet another playbook to scrutinise, yet this one is dedicated to completely how they think Muslim women should be shown on screen. So please sit back, relax and prepare yourself, because today we're diving into one of the most unintentionally poor documents ever written about religion and representation. This is what happens when gaming feminists and gender theorists who can't write a believable woman to save their lives decide they're qualified to redefine Islam for the entertainment industry. It's preachy, it's patronising, and it's just as out of touch as you would expect. So with that said, I am Lady Decade, and if you enjoy a good counter narrative, then hit that subscribe button. Let's talk about the gaming feminists who are pretending to understand Islam. Religion plays a bigger role in some people's lives than gaming ever could, though judging by how some of these activists write, you'd think that they're the ones founding a new faith. But if you'd rather spend your time playing games rather than being preached at about them, let me remind you that I can help you access all of the best modern releases for next to nothing. Use my links to get 38% off a Silent Hill F, 29% off Black Myth Wukong, 24% off a Final Fantasy Tactics The Ivalice Chronicles, and up to 90% off of pretty much any game that you can think of. So grab some bargains, and I hope you enjoy the rest of this video. The Surviving to Thriving the Muslim Women on-Screen Test is a checklist created by the Geena Davis Institute on Gender in Media that's meant to assess how Muslim women are portrayed in film, television and games. It's designed to measure whether characters move beyond stereotypes such as being oppressed or voiceless, and instead are shown as thriving individuals with agency, depth and positive representation. As one would expect though, if you have watched any of my other videos on GDI, in practice it of course functions like yet another ideological scoring system, reducing complex cultural and religious identities to a set of criteria for studios to tick off in order to appear progressive, rather than encouraging genuine understanding or nuanced storytelling. In its Muslim Women on-Screen test, the Institute warns creators against what they refer to as exotic or highly sexualized depictions of Muslim women, citing characters such as wives, belly dancers, or enslaved sex workers as products of Islam's image problem. While it might sound noble at first glance, the irony is that this statement exposes a spectacular level of ignorance the very moment the document begins. The authors confidently wade into history armed with nothing but buzzwords, blissfully unaware that the dance they're referencing predates Islam by several millennia. Archaeological and historical evidence traces its roots back to ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia. Ritual movements tied to fertility and goddess worship devoted to deities like Isis and Ishtar, long before the Quran existed. It's the kind of mistake that only happens when activists try to rewrite history with nothing but a few bad takes and a sociology degree. In fact, the UCLA Encyclopedia of Egyptology notes that the oldest depictions of dance come from the pre-dynastic period, 4000 to 3200 BC, depicting female figures, perhaps goddesses or priestesses, dancing with upraised arms. Islam, by contrast, was founded in the 7th century AD. That represents a historical gap of over 3 millennia, yet somehow a 21st century media consultancy group has decided to conflate this ancient pre-Islamic tradition with a modern Muslim identity stereotype. And worst of all, they call that progress. The irony, of course, is that in its zeal to protect Muslim women from misrepresentation, the Geena Davis Institute has ended up committing a quiet act of cultural erasure. An ancient multicultural art form has been stripped of its diverse origins and repackaged as a purely Islamic symbol, with thousands of years of history bulldozed to fit a modern activist narrative. What was once a shared human heritage has been overwritten by ideology, a perfect example of how identity politics can erase the very cultures it pretends to defend. For the record, belly dancing isn't universally accepted within the Islamic world. It's outright banned in countries such as Saudi Arabia, Iran and Afghanistan, where conservative interpretations of Islam view the dance as indecent or un-Islamic. Yet, in other Muslim-majority nations, it remains an integral part of local culture. In Egypt, Lebanon and Turkey, for example, belly dancing is woven into social celebrations, weddings and regional folklore, not as a religious expression but as a form of artistic and cultural heritage which, as already mentioned, predates Islam by centuries. It's a reminder that the Islamic world is not a monolith. Cultural practices vary enormously from one country to another. Reducing a dance with ancient diverse roots to a single religious lens ignores the very cultural richness that makes it endure. Then again, what else can we expect from the Geena Davis Institute? Both the Muslim Women on-Screen test and the GDI playbook claim to guide creators towards more respectful portrayals, presenting themselves as tools of cultural sensitivity, frameworks to ensure Muslim women aren't depicted as oppressed, exotic, or background decoration. Yet reading them closely reveals something far more troubling. Islam isn't treated as a vast and complex civilization with its own history, philosophy and internal diversity, but as just another checkbox in the Western activist spreadsheet of marginalized identities. Its rich traditions are flattened to conform to modern Western ideological norms, regardless of whether those norms have any foundation in Islamic belief or historical reality. Much like many of the games they influence, GDI produced some truly cringe-worthy reading. One of the most striking issues within the Institute's broader work is its assumption that Western feminist frameworks can simply be mapped onto non-Western faiths, as though the cultural and theological dynamics of Islam mirrored those of secular democracies. It treats all women as seeking liberation in the same way and for the same reasons, collapsing vast moral and spiritual differences into a single Western narrative of progress. Even the Institute's own documentation acknowledges this shortcoming, admitting that the entire framework applies Western feminist theory to non-Western cultures without adequately accounting for how colonialism and Orientalism created the stereotypes they're trying to address. This isn't a minor oversight, but an ideological blind spot. The feminism shaping the GDI's guidance emerged from a post-Enlightenment worldview that prioritises personal autonomy and liberation from tradition, values that naturally conflict with religions, such as Islam, which define freedom through submission to divine law rather than independence from it. This kind of thinking isn't new. In fact, it's part of a much older Western habit of moral grandstanding disguised as compassion. Even the anthropologist Laila Abu-Lughod, hardly a conservative voice, warned about this in her essay, Do Muslim Women Really Need Saving?, pointing out how Western elites use the language of women's rights as a moral cover for cultural interference, treating the veil as a symbol of oppression rather than an expression of faith. The women of GDI are a new self-appointed moral class using liberation as a justification for lecturing everyone else. And now it's apparently with PowerPoint slides and diversity jargon. The same moral pattern is evident in the Institute's language, only now the Western elites have been replaced by media consultants and the rhetoric of salvation has been rebranded as inclusion. Muslim women are no longer portrayed as needing rescue from despotic husbands or patriarchal societies, but from portrayals that fail to reflect Western progressive values. This isn't to say that criticism of injustice in Muslim societies is invalid, far, far, far from it, but it must begin from an understanding of how those societies define morality, not from a framework that treats secular feminism as a universal truth. In trying to liberate Muslim women, the Institute reproduces the very colonial logic it claims to have outgrown, only now the sermon comes via corporate diversity workshops. Perhaps the most revealing flaw in this framework is how quietly it folds Islam into the language of Western identity politics, treating it not as a faith rooted in divine law and centuries of civilization, but just another marginalised group to be slotted neatly alongside the LGBTQIA+ community, racial minorities, and women in STEM. It's an absurd reduction, a world religion followed by nearly 2 billion people across vastly different cultures, boiled down to a checkbox on the same activist spreadsheet as office diversity training. It's the literal height of Western narcissism to assume that a global faith needs to be explained or reframed through the same buzzwords used in HR seminars. The idea that Muslim women in Cairo or Jakarta exist within the same socio-political category as corporate interns in San Francisco isn't cultural diversity, it's condescension disguised as compassion. This approach doesn't elevate Islam, it belittles it. Islam isn't a lifestyle choice or a social identity, it's a complete moral and metaphysical system that shapes law, art, ethics and daily life for billions. It's patronising in the extreme, as though an ancient civilization needs validation from a Hollywood think tank. The self-importance and moral hubris of these people disgusts me. This bizarre view of where one of the world's major religions fits into modern society runs through the DEI playbook like a thread of unexamined ideology. The document openly assumes that all so-called marginalised groups share the same political priorities: LGBTQIA+, affirmation, gender fluidity and other distinctly Western concepts, without the slightest acknowledgement that the global Muslim community holds an entirely different set of moral, cultural and theological beliefs. It's a comforting fiction, the notion that every group share a common struggle and therefore a common set of values, but it collapses under even mild theological scrutiny. Islam, by its own definition, is not an identity, it's a literal submission to divine law. Its moral code doesn't sway with the latest social media trend, it's grounded in the Quran and over a millennium of scholarship. But try telling that to the self-appointed visionaries at the GDI, who seem to think that they can cram a 1400-year-old religion into a gaming textbook about gender theory. In their rush to make everything fit into their regressive intersectional mould, they've managed the impressive feat of erasing the very convictions they pretend to celebrate. The idiocy is astounding. Not only are Muslims very different from the other groups they use as examples in their intersectional framework, but the numbers make that painfully obvious. According to the Pew Research Centre's Global Divide on Homosexuality 2020, a median of 70% of Muslims across 34 countries said that homosexuality should be rejected by society. In the 2021 follow-up, Religion and Views on Morality, that figure rose to over 80% in nations such as Jordan, Egypt and Indonesia. Yet, the GDI's writers barrel ahead as though none of this exists, as if a few pages of inclusive storytelling guidelines can overwrite 14 centuries of theology. Most of us are very aware of this moral worldview, which is grounded in their divine law. As Dr. Yusuf al-Qaradawi put into his piece The Lawful and the Prohibited in Islam, the consensus of scholars is clear that homosexual acts are haram, or forbidden, and carry severe moral condemnation. No amount of intersectional wishful thinking is going to make that disappear, yet the Geena Davis Institute's framework imagines a seamless intersection where Islamic devotion, gender fluidity and sexual liberation coexist without conflict, a vision that may please Western corporations keen to advertise inclusivity, but which bears little resemblance to the lived theology of most Muslims worldwide. This ideological flattening doesn't empower representation, it alienates it. It implies that belief is negotiable and that acceptance in media depends on conforming to values imported from California rather than drawn from the Quran. The result is a curious form of secular paternalism. Islam is praised, but only in its sanitized Western-approved form, one that mirrors progressive ideals rather than authentic faith. Genuine belief, with its laws, obligations and moral boundaries, becomes something to be edited out of the frame. In other words, Muslims are welcome to the table, provided that they keep quiet about what they actually believe in. This inconsistency becomes even more apparent in how the Institute handles religious conservatism across different faiths. In the playbook, Christian traditionalism is often portrayed as reactionary, the realm of fundamentalists who must evolve. Yet, when similar convictions appear within Islam, opposition to abortion, emphasis on modesty, and defined family roles, the tone softens. Muslim characters are not condemned for their values, but recast as victims of patriarchy or misunderstood progressives awaiting Western enlightenment. In effect, the Institute doesn't reject religion outright, it just demands that faith be edited, softened, including LGBTQIA+ Muslims, encouraging writers to present the same-sex attraction within Islamic settings as an act of courage or liberation. The intention is inclusivity. The result is distortion. In practice, it amounts to what critics have called gay washing, writing religious characters to affirm Western social values rather than reflecting the reality of their faith. By celebrating fictional Muslims who freely embrace lifestyles that Islam explicitly forbids, the Institute replaces authenticity with projection. The result is a cinematic illusion, characters who exist not as believers with inner conflict, but as narrative instruments designed to reassure Western audiences of their own moral virtue. Such portrayals don't challenge prejudice, they replace it with a softer kind of Orientalism, one where the East is no longer mysterious but conveniently progressive. All of this reminds a quiet paradox at the heart of the Geena Davis Institute's model. Its authors pride themselves on dismantling stereotypes, yet their work depends on creating idealized Muslims who conform to Western liberal sensibilities. By refusing to engage with Islam on its own theological terms, they produce characters who may please Hollywood but feel alien to the vast majority of Muslims worldwide. One passage from the Muslim Women on-Screen test reveals this bias with striking clarity. A harmful portrayal, it says, includes any scene where a Muslim woman is shown as being primitive, backwards, or otherwise out of touch with modern society, for example, lacking modern technology, wearing outdated clothes, or being intolerant of others' ideas. On the surface, that sounds like a warning against caricature. In reality, it makes for accurate historical portrayals being almost impossible. A religious person, by definition, is bound by their faith. They cannot simply adopt every modern idea without abandoning the very principles that make them devout. Expecting believers to mirror secular values isn't progress. It's yet more cultural erasure dressed up as empathy. If a filmmaker depicted 16th century Istanbul authentically, so veiled noblewomen in embroidered robes, scholars teaching in madrasas, or merchants trading in the bazaars, the work would automatically fail the Institute's test. In its logic, merely placing Muslim women in their own historical setting becomes proof of regression. This approach exposes a distinctly Western bias that equates modernity with moral progress and tradition with inferiority. As historian Darian Meacham observed in the Journal of Cultural Critique published in 2023, a medieval knight isn't called primitive, yet an Ottoman noblewoman in period dress is. European history is permitted to exist on its own terms, rich in nuance and heritage, while non-Western history is tolerated only when reframed as an early step towards liberal modernity. Can you see the glaring double standards? The irony is that many of the virtues the Institute celebrates, so scholarship, tolerance, artistic achievement and scientific inquiry, were flourishing in Muslim civilization centuries before the European Enlightenment. To erase these depictions out of fear of appearing primitive is to erase the very history that helped inspire Europe's own intellectual revival. In attempting to protect Muslim women from misrepresentation, the Institute ends up infantilizing them, implying that their cultures can only be shown as modern if they conform visually to Western ideals of progress. By modern Western standards, every culture before 1960 apparently needs saving. And in applying that logic, the Institute doesn't dismantle stereotypes, it simply replaces the old Orientalist lens with a new ideologically sanitized one. Another revealing feature of the Geena Davis Institute's model lies in who it allows to speak for Muslim identity. Both the GDI playbook and the Muslim Women on-Screen test advise creators to consult organisations such as Muslim Casting, the Pillars Fund and the Muslim List when seeking authenticity. On paper, that sounds responsible, a safeguard against misrepresentation, but in practice it creates a controlled echo chamber where only certain ideological viewpoints are permitted. These groups, while entitled to their activism, largely represent a particular strand of American progressivism, one that blends faith specifically with American liberal social values. Missing are the conservative scholars who defend orthodoxy, reformers who challenge it, and secular or ex-Muslim voices who critique it. The result is a narrow ideological bandwidth dressed up as diversity. This narrowing of perspective creates what might be called curated authenticity, research filtered through ideological pre-approval. Writers are encouraged to do their homework, but only with sources already aligned with the Institute's worldview. What remains is an illusion of inclusivity, diversity of appearance, masking uniformity of thought, and in choosing whose voices may be heard, the Institute reveals its real concern is not diversity of belief, but control of narrative. In the end, the Geena Davis Institute's consultation service doesn't expand representation, it places it. The truth, though, is that beyond the policy papers and Hollywood guidelines, real Muslim women are already reclaiming their own stories. Across the Middle East, North Africa and the diaspora, many have revived Raqs Sharqi, the traditional dance mislabeled in the West as belly dancing, not as rebellion against Islam, but as a reaffirmation of cultural heritage. As one Egyptian dancer told SharqiDance.com in 2025, it is part of who we are, not a religious statement, not rebellion, simply a celebration of life. At the same time, many devout Muslim women choose to reject Raqs Sharqi entirely, seeing it as inconsistent with Islamic modesty. Their stance is equally valid because it reflects personal conviction rather than the moral templates imposed by outsiders. Between cultural expression and religious restraint lies a spectrum of belief that no self-serving checklist could ever capture. This diversity extends far beyond art. Muslims form the most racially and ethnically varied faith group on earth. According to the Pew Research Center, only about 14% are Arab. The majority live in South and Southeast Asia, with vast populations in Indonesia, Pakistan, Bangladesh and India, alongside millions across Africa, Europe and the Americas. The Institute's tendency to speak of a single Muslim experience ignores not only this global variety, but also Islam's internal pluralism, Sunni, Shia, Ibadi, Sufi, Ahmadi and more, along with its role in the civil rights movements from Algeria's liberation to the activism of Malcolm X. No matter how much GDI want to try, an authentic representation can't be engineered through Western guilt or corporate frameworks. It begins with listening to historians, theologians, and believers themselves rather than projecting fashionable theories onto them. The Geena Davis Institute undoubtedly thinks it means well. Its mission statements drip with the usual corporate sanctimony, a self-congratulatory promise to reshape culture through equality, fairness, and inclusion. But its handling of Islam exposes what this project really is: moral imperialism dressed up as progress. The Institute's writers seem to believe that the only path to virtue is submission to Western social dogma. They talk about representation while steamrolling over the very cultures they claim to defend, rewriting centuries of belief and history to fit the worldview of a Silicon Valley HR seminar. The Institute claims to be defending Muslim women, but what it's really protecting is the Western ego, the smug conviction that everyone everywhere would be happier if they just thought like us. If Hollywood genuinely wanted to portray Muslim women with honesty, it wouldn't consult the people trying to turn their religion into a marketing exercise, it would actually listen to the women themselves. Now, I must admit that this was a particularly heavy topic today, so to recover you might feel like having some fun. Use my links to get 38% off Silent Hill F, 29% off Black Myth Wukong, 24% off Final Fantasy Tactics The Ivalice Chronicles, and up to 90% off pretty much any game that you can think of. And alternatively, if you want a break from discussing ancient religions, why not check out my video on an ancient console? That's right, over on the Lady Arcade YouTube channel, I have just taken a deep dive look at the Vectrix. Subscribe to both channels and I'll see you all again soon.